All right, so next presentation is by Angèle. Angèle, you can go ahead.
Thank you. And please, if my audio starts to sound bad, please just stop me. Is everybody ready? Okay, great. So my name is Angèle Poirier and I live in Regina, Saskatchewan, and my presentation is called What Motivates Recreational Cannabis Consumption in Canada? So the objective of this research is to identify how consumers of legal versus illicit recreational cannabis differ from each other. If each of these consumer groups had particular characteristics, then policy could be targeted to achieve goals like reduced consumption of all types of cannabis, or displacement of the illicit market, or enhancing public awareness, for example, about cannabis-related health risks. So what are the gaps that my research will fill? Well, the economic research done so far on cannabis has not explicitly separated legal from illicit and medicinal from recreational cannabis consumption. For example, this 2021 report by Michelle Roderman at Stats Canada shows the breakdown of the percentage of consumers who report illegal and illicit sources, but the report does not distinguish between recreational versus medicinal consumption. My research is specifically on recreational, not medicinal, because the motive to consume for medicinal purposes is going to be far different than recreational, so we would expect different consumer behavior. There's also been a lot of work done on price elasticity of demand for cannabis, but again, no distinction between legal or illicit, nor between recreational and medicinal. And my work, again, makes both of these distinctions. So the variable of interest here, the dependent variable, is the amount of cannabis consumed, everything from 0 to no upper bound. I've used data from the National Cannabis Survey from StatsCan, and respondents report how much of each type they consumed and where they got it. So a person might say, for example, 10 grams of dried flower and 5 grams of hash, and to get the level of consumption, you have to multiply the more condensed forms by a Health Canada conversion factor. So the concentrates are multiplied by 4. So in our example, 5 grams of hash would actually be 20 grams of dried flower equivalent. And so you would add up all of those dried flower equivalents to get one nice continuous dependent variable for analysis. Now my data set is from the National Cannabis Survey waves 5 through 9, which are the waves covering consumption post-legalization. So after October 17th, 2018. 90% of respondents reported consuming 0 cannabis. The 5 and 10 are just arbitrary here. I'm making the point there's a lot of zeros. So you have to find a way to deal with these zeros. Now I've used Craig's hurdle model, but first I'll talk about the other models and why I didn't use them. So the go-to model for a pileup of zeros is the simple Tobit model, excuse me, or the Tobit type 1. And this model is commonly used to find how the 0 respondents differ from the non-zeros. And this would have been fine, but I wanted to go a step further. I wanted to identify not just how consumers are different than non-consumers, but I also wanted to find the difference between light and heavy users. So I wanted to ask 2 questions at the same time. What gets you over the hurdle of deciding you'll participate in the recreational cannabis market? And secondly, once you're there, are you going to be a light or a heavy user? So enter the hurdle models or 2-step models. Now, a very common 2-step model is the Heckman model, which I did not use, also known as the Tobit type 2. And this model answers the first question, what factors predict that an observation will be a non-zero? And secondly, how do those same factors affect whether the non-zero value will be big or small? But the downfalls are that you can't change the independent variables, the predictors between those 2 steps. And this Heckman model also assumes that the zeros are unobserved values. Like in a wage data set, for example, a 0 wage would just be a person who's not in the labor force, but doesn't mean they value their labor at $0 per hour. Whereas in mine, My zeros are actual people who have the option of consuming cannabis, and they're not choosing to consume. They're not missing values. They're just not consumers. So because of this missing value assumption, the Heckman model was out the window. So that led me to the model I used, Craig's hurdle model. So again, first step, what factors predict any positive amount of recreational cannabis consumption? And second step, how much cannabis will they consume once they've cleared that model? So my findings are that indeed the two groups are different. In the legal market, being male is the strongest predictor of consuming legal recreational cannabis and more of it. And in the illicit market, being a teenager is the strongest predictor of consumption. And living in a rural area also makes you slightly more likely to consume more illicit cannabis. And in both markets, if you're a daily user, you're more likely to be a heavy user. Well, duh. And I also found that in nominal terms, more cannabis is actually being consumed from the legal market than from the illicit market in nominal terms. So the policy relevance is based on the purpose of the Cannabis Act, which is on screen. We'll take these one at a time. My work is relevant in two ways. First, how are these objectives, are these objectives being hit? And secondly, if they're not, how might they be attained? So first of all, A, protect the health of young persons by restricting their access to cannabis. Well, my results show that actually young people are getting their hands on cannabis, and it's the illicit kind, the bad kind. So young people are being kept out of the legal market, but not out of the illicit market. So it's not working. B, protect young persons and others from inducements to use cannabis. My results show that males are more likely to consume legal cannabis than non-males, and teens are more likely to consume illicit. So this tells us if you're going to try to reduce overall cannabis consumption, you should target those two demographics, males and teenagers. C, provide for the licit, that's the legal, the good kind, production of cannabis to reduce illicit activities. So this means displacing the illicit market. Well, my results show that rural dwellers consume more illicit cannabis than non-rural dwellers. So I recommend to lower the barriers to entry into the legal market and encourage the opening of retail stores in rural places. How? Reduce the red tape required to be licensed by Health Canada, allow private retailers to sell legal cannabis in all provinces, and increase retail store density, perhaps by increasing access to capital so these private retailers can invest and expand. As a side note, Colorado has a retail store density in their legal market of 10 per 100,000 population, and Canada's at like 2. So we've got a ways to go, people. D, deter illicit activities in relation to cannabis. So this basically means more policing, but you got to pay for it. You could put a sin tax on cannabis the way you do on alcohol and tobacco, but you can't tax the illicit market, so you're taxing only legal, which means the price is going to go up relative to illicit. So you're just going to make people switch to illicit, which is counterproductive. So E, reduce the burden on the criminal justice system in relation to cannabis. So legalization in the first place already makes a bunch of activity legal. So I think that they've achieved this, and any deeper analysis is not in the scope of my research. F, provide access to a quality controlled supply of cannabis. I think they've achieved that. Here in Regina, we've got retail stores all over the place. Although again, I think in the rural areas, we need some more legal stores. G, enhance public awareness. My results show that teens and males are the ones who are more likely to participate in the recreational cannabis markets. So my policy recommendation is to target educational efforts towards those two demographics. As a side note, cannabis use disorder is on the rise in high-income countries like the US and Canada, including more hospitalizations. And I will point out that the THC content in recreational cannabis is also on the rise. Now, the health effects of cannabis use disorder are widely studied, but not in the scope of my research. I only bring it up to say that recreational cannabis consumption is something that we should be, and we are, monitoring. And with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions as you look at this very funny dude on the screen.
Thank you, Angèle.
You're welcome.
To start off our judges Q&A, let's start with Jeremy.
Thank you, Angèle. This is really interesting. This is not the kind of thing I was expecting in this forum, but it has a real value in that already. I'm actually struggling in a way for a question, because I think that the work does a good job of sort of pointing the way to things. I guess, if anything, do you have a comment for a policymaker that could come back and say, how would you overcome maybe some biases in rural areas to advertising or promoting what could be seen as promoting the use of illicit substances, or licit substances actually, but you know, recreational drug use?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. And as part of my research, I interviewed pot shop owners in rural places. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to ask that question, right? Like, oh, you know, you're selling you're like a shop of sin, you know, and how does everybody perceive you? But we got there anyways. And she actually said, I mean, this is anecdotal, but she actually said that especially through the economic slowdown in 2020, pot shops were deemed essential services, and so they never closed. And she said that they were busier than ever. She also commented that her clientele includes lots of old grannies who come in like for pain management and these types of things. So on that front, the reality, I think, is hopeful, although it doesn't directly answer your question, which is what advice would I have to a policymaker? So I guess the advice I would have to a policymaker is to A, seek out these success stories that actually are buried when you go to search for them. And B, once you have found these success stories of rural pot shops that are actually thriving, spotlight them so that everybody else can see it. And it will be one more thing to make that stigma go away.
Thank you.
You are welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for the question.
You bet.
Marion is next.
I'd just like to know, what are some of the variables affecting cannabis use in addition to age and sex? And also, what are the variables affecting the cannabis used for recreational purposes of males? What variables determine how much different males use?
So your first question is, what else affects not the likelihood, but the participation in the cannabis market?
Yes.
Yeah, aside from male and being a teenager. Maybe I'll answer that question with what doesn't, because I tried everything. Like, you know how it is, you've got this massive data set and all these variables available to you, and you go crazy and try everything. And I was surprised at what didn't affect it. So province, I did not find was significant. The source of cannabis, so even though I've presented it as legal and illicit, there's actually 11 different sources that people will report, and then I had to categorize them from there. So whether it's like online or got it from a friend or these different things, that wasn't significant. Your daily activities, whether you're retired or you're working or you're looking for work or caring for someone or whatever, like I thought somebody who's unemployed is going to be at home and depressed and just getting baked all the time because their life sucks. Not a predictor at all. I will say, and I didn't present this in my results, but being retired, I was surprised actually was not significant at all. And that's why I didn't report on it. But I tried it after that lady had said that she's got a lot of grannies. And then there is a mental health variable as well. which is just like a rating from 1 to 3. Do I think my mental health is like good, bad, or in the middle? That was not significant either. And I thought that income would be significant, and it wasn't. So I'm sorry to have somewhat of a disappointing answer to you. Male and teen were like the best ones over and over. And forgive me, Marion, I think you had a second part of your question.
Well, it was to take age as a separate independent, teenagers, as say an independent group, and then find the variables, tell me the variables that affected which teenagers chose to participate and which didn't.
Yes, I understand. Taking teenagers as a subset and seeing what might predict. You know, that actually would be an area for future research. The suspicion I have about this particular data set is that even if you did take teenagers as a subset, they would be rather homogenous, because the types of questions that are asked in this survey, I don't think would shed a lot of light on the differences between these teenagers. You know, for example, your daily activity. Every teenager is pretty much doing the same thing all day. They're being a teenager and going to high school, you know, as an example. Although, and I'll close with this, because I know we're short on time, it would be more interesting to do a more regional analysis. So all I did was provincial, but I would like to dig down a little bit deeper than that. And that potentially could flesh out some differences between teenagers. But I leave it for an area of future research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marion.
Thank you. So Hugh, you're next.
That was very well done, and thank you, Marion, for taking my question, because I was questioning the other variables as well. So you answered most of my questions. You brought up something that I thought, and I'm not sure if you came across it in your research or in the literature out there, but this notion of, you know, elasticity with marijuana. And one of the things, if you looked at cross-price elasticity or substitutability of other illicit drugs or you know, even legal drugs like alcohol. And I don't know, would that type of analysis fit into your research, or could it fit into your research that, you know, a rural area consumes marijuana because that may be their only choice? And I don't know if that question makes sense, but it kind of tweaked when you mentioned that. It kind of you know, got me thinking about if you could work that into your research.
Yeah, I love your question, which was not framed as a question, but I have lots to say about it. I do just want to back up, because you did say that you were wondering about other variables. I forgot to mention, I also thought that the type of cannabis you consume would be an important variable, whether it's a liquid concentrate or joints or hash or whatever. And it wasn't. I was totally surprised, but it's also probably because the vast majority of cannabis consumers are just consuming plain old dried flower. It was like 95% of the sample or some crazy thing. Okay, so now about elasticities. So as part of my literature review, I do examine elasticity work that's been done around the world on cannabis. Again, they've never sorted out, you know, the illicit versus legal. We do find that the own price elasticity of cannabis ranges everything from like 0.4 to, you know, 2.1, but we've got jurisdictions in here that include Europe. So a high elasticity is going to mean that they've got a lot of substitutes available to them, which is a reality in European places, but not in Canada. I didn't bring it up in my results, but I did find that the own price elasticity of legal and illicit cannabis were 0.37 and 0.38. I forget which is which, but you might as well just say they're both 0.4. They're both not elastic, which means that consumers are not sensitive to price. So now about the cross-price elasticity. This was my honors project a couple of years ago in my last year of my undergrad. And I did a cross-price elasticity analysis modeled after the work of Amlung and McKillop, who basically they just did a curve fitting exercise based on hypothetical purchase tasks from like 135 respondents in Ontario. The sample size was low, the jurisdiction was tiny. I hesitate, you know, like you need to interpret with caution. But the most important thing that I found from there is that there seemed to be, empirically, there was a preference for legal. So basically what it meant was, I have to think this through again. You've got a legal consumer and you've got a change in the price of illicit. Let's say that illicit becomes cheaper. Those consumers that were already in the legal market were more reluctant to switch over to illicit compared to how quickly the illicit consumers would switch over to legal. So this showed a preference for legal, which implied that you could charge a premium. So meaning that you could have a higher price for legal cannabis than you can for illicit. Again, it's encouraging because it means, oh, look, Canada, like we get to, you know, put a sin tax on legal cannabis and we can then pay for the criminal justice costs or whatever. But the empirical research also showed that it's only to a point. It was only like, I'm going by memory here, like 10 or 20%. The price of legal could only be 10 or 20% higher than illicit before that preference just dropped out. And they said, okay, I'm just going to the cheaper stuff. You know, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. No, that was great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Hugh.
Okay, so we're running a little bit behind, but we still have Mark and Ramona. Mark, do you want to start?
I'll keep my answers shorter, sorry.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. First of all, congratulations for collaborating with two of the most noted scholars in the area, Jay and Silent Bob. I was happy to see that. So my question actually was on elasticity, but Hugh basically asked it. So I'll ask another one. You mentioned that being a male was the strongest determinant of legal cannabis use. Is that because they're more likely to consume cannabis, or is it because conditional on consuming cannabis, they're more likely to make a legal choice compared to females?
The answer is yes.
It was A or B.
I know, but I think it's both. Okay, so like you've got two steps of the hurdle model. You've got and remember, I ran these separately, once for legal, once for illicit. They're not run at the same time, which is a limitation. It's something that you could do in the future, is to run like a systems approach. But make sure I don't get this wrong. So in the illicit market, it made no difference. Okay, being male made no difference. In the legal market, it was both. It was, if you're male, you're more likely to participate consuming any non-zero amount of legal cannabis. And once you're consuming, you are more likely to consume a greater amount of cannabis than your other non-male people who are also already consuming, who have cleared the hurdle. Does that answer the question?
It was more about use in general. So the fact, like, are males consume? I assume males are consuming more cannabis in general. I'm not talking about the intense versus the extent, the intensive and extensive margins. That's what you're talking about. I'm talking about, are males more likely to consume legal cannabis? That statement that you made at the beginning, is that due to the fact that males are simply more likely to consume cannabis in general, both legal and illicit?
Oh, no. No.
Okay, so they are more likely to make legal choices conditional on consuming cannabis. Okay, I found that a bit surprising, given, like, if you just look at, you know, the ratio of men and women in prison, for example, and the choices they make. I found that a bit surprising. So it was very interesting.
I was very surprised by that as well, that the male variable was insignificant in the illicit models. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I do want to make a comment about cross-price elasticity, coming back to that. The data set doesn't have prices for illicit cannabis, only for legal cannabis. So cross-price elasticity, it's really tough to get pricing data on illicit cannabis.
Okay, Ramona.
I'll be very quick. So my question is essentially about this transition to legal consumption. How do you sort of promote that among young adults without promoting the use in general? You still want to keep folks who are uninterested in taking it to not, but those who might be interested, you want to transition them right at that 18-year mark. How do you do that from
Yeah.
a policy perspective?
To me, it would have to be a two-pronged approach. I'm just bringing up my slide again that has the policy, the purposes of the Cannabis Act, and they're both in there, aren't they? They're, well, let's keep cannabis, all cannabis, out of the hands of youth, and let's displace the illicit market, meaning let's get those illicit consumers to switch to legal. So to me, it would have to be a both and approach. I don't think that you could successfully achieve your policy goals by only harping on cannabis is bad, 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 nobody do it at all, bad, bad, bad. Like, because you're just going to alienate a significant portion of your audience. They're going to think you're a crackpot because, you know, you're denying whatever, these other health benefits, whatever. And there's some people that are just never, ever going to quit. At the same time, though, you're not going to get anywhere by only keeping cannabis out of the hands of youth, because it's such a societal thing. Like, I don't want to use the word peer pressure because there's negative connotations, but like it's like any other bad thing that teenagers do. The more you tell them not to do it, they're just going to do it anyways. So I think it's got to be both. I think that you have to try to target the populations that you know are most susceptible to harms, because let's be realistic, there are people who can consume cannabis in moderate amounts and not go out of control and not have disorders, right? So target the people that are most susceptible to harms, and have a holistic approach about it.
Okay, I think that concludes our Q&A session for now. Just